Amid U.S. President Donald Trump's threats to annex Canada and take our natural resources, the focus has turned to our water supply.
Colombia announced that the U.S. government has paused negotiations on the expansive Columbia River Treaty, saying the current administration is reviewing its international engagements.
America is entering a danger zone that few people expected to see so soon. The Southwest is drying at a pace that scientists once predicted for the distant future. Reservoirs are shrinking, farms are cutting back planting, and major cities are scrambling to secure enough supply for the next decade. This growing pressure is now pushing U.S. leaders toward ideas that once sounded unthinkable. The moment that shifted the conversation came when Donald Trump publicly suggested that the United States should look north toward Canada's vast freshwater reserves. The comment was brief, but the reaction wasn't. Canada pushed back instantly, treating the idea as a threat to its identity and its sovereignty. That clash marked the beginning of a much bigger story. What started with drought and climate stress is now turning into a strategic question that could redefine the balance between two of the world's closest allies. The water crisis in the American West has been building for decades, but the speed of the current decline has pushed it into emergency territory. The Colorado River, which supports more than 40 million people across 7 states, has lost a significant share of its flow over the last 20 years. Scientists estimate long-term reductions of around 20%, driven by rising temperatures, weaker snowpack, and years of overuse. What was once one of North America's most reliable water systems is now struggling to meet even basic demand. Lake Mead, the giant reservoir that keeps lights on and taps running from Nevada to California, has fallen to the lowest levels ever recorded. Boat ramps sit on dry land, intake towers are inches from exposure, and the shoreline continues to retreat. These drops are not seasonal swings. They reveal a system stretched far beyond its limits. Cities like Phoenix and Las Vegas are trying to adapt by investing in massive recycling facilities and advanced reuse technology. California is spending billions on desalination plants and upgrading irrigation systems to reduce waste. Yet even with these projects, the gap between supply and demand keeps widening. The West simply uses more water than nature can replace. Agriculture adds another layer of strain. California's Central Valley produces a huge share of America's fruits, vegetables, and nuts, but fields are being left unplanted because farmers cannot secure enough water to keep operations running. As populations in desert states continue to grow, the pressure only intensifies. This environment explains why Trump's remarks touched a nerve across the continent. From the perspective of the U.S. Southwest, the search for new water sources is no longer optional. The crisis is structural, long-term, and steadily worsening, and that reality sets the stage for the conflict that follows. As drought tightened its grip on the American West, one moment pushed the issue onto the global stage. During a public event, Donald Trump suggested that the United States should consider accessing Canada's massive freshwater reserves.
We have millions of gallons of water pouring down from the north with the snow caps in Canada and all pouring down. And they have essentially a very large faucet.
He framed it as a practical idea. If one region of the continent has water and another is running dry, then cooperation should be part of the conversation. It wasn't a detailed policy proposal, but it immediately caught attention because it came at a time when water shortages were turning into long-term threats for millions of Americans. Trump's remark opened a door that policymakers in several states had quietly been examining. Officials in Arizona and Nevada had already explored the possibility of long-distance water transfers, including early concepts of pipelines stretching from Canada's northern rivers into the American Southwest. These ideas had been discussed behind the scenes for years, but they had never entered mainstream political debate until Trump mentioned them. In Washington, the comment triggered renewed interest in earlier studies about a North American water grid, a large-scale network of pipelines designed to move fresh water across borders, similar to how oil and gas infrastructure operates today. Think tanks circulated cost estimates ranging from tens to hundreds of billions of dollars. Supporters argued that modern engineering could make such a system possible and that both countries might benefit from a shared continental approach. The idea spread quickly through U.S. media and conservative political circles. Many Americans viewed it as common sense, especially in states facing shrinking reservoirs, stressed farmland, and rapid population growth. To them, Trump had simply said out loud what many officials had been thinking quietly. But the same message landed very differently in Canada. What sounded like cooperation in the United States immediately raised fears of pressure, dependence, and future demands north of the border, setting up the sharp response that followed. The reaction inside Canada was immediate and unmistakably firm. Within hours of Trump's remarks gaining traction in the United States, officials in Ottawa delivered a clear message. Canada would not export its freshwater, no negotiations, no pilot projects, no discussions about pipelines or long-term transfers. The federal government shut the door completely. Prime Minister Mark Carney reinforced that position in direct, deliberate language. Standing before reporters, he said, "Canada's water is not for sale." It was more than a policy statement. It was a line drawn across the entire debate, signaling that water sits in a category Canada refuses to treat like timber, minerals, or energy. Carney framed it as part of the country's identity and collective responsibility, something that belongs to the land and the people, not the market. His message resonated instantly across the country. In Canada, water carries emotional weight. Lakes, rivers, and wetlands shape nearly every province, and many communities see them as the heart of their culture and natural heritage. The idea of exporting freshwater feels, to many Canadians, like giving away a piece of who they are. Even individuals who rarely agree on national issues found themselves aligned on this one point. That unity is rare in Canadian politics, and it shows how deeply this concern runs. Underlying Carney's statement was a fear that goes beyond economics. Once a country starts trading water, it risks creating a precedent that cannot easily be reversed. Trade deals could give foreign partners leverage. International companies could pursue rights. Market pressures could push decisions in directions Canadians never intended. In Carney's view, the first sale would be the moment control begins to slip. That is why the response was so strong. Protecting water is seen as protecting sovereignty itself, a mindset that shapes everything. Canada says next, Canada's refusal to discuss water exports comes from a deeper calculation than politics or emotion. The country holds close to 20% of the world's freshwater reserves, an amount unmatched by almost any other major economy. That scale turns water into a strategic asset, something that protects the country's long-term security just as much as energy or food. Canadian officials worry that once water becomes an export commodity, it stops being fully Canadian. Trade agreements can turn shared resources into shared obligations. Foreign companies could demand stable long-term supply contracts. International partners might claim rights under existing trade rules. In other words, the moment water enters the market, Canada risks losing the freedom to decide how it is used within its own borders. Environmental concerns add another layer of resistance. Much of Canada's freshwater flows through fragile ecosystems, wetlands, river deltas, and glacier-fed basins that are already stressed by rising temperatures and unpredictable rainfall. Large-scale diversion toward the south could reduce river flows, disrupt fish populations, and alter watersheds in ways scientists say may be irreversible. Once water leaves a river system, it can't simply be put back. This is why Mark Carney framed his warning so sharply. In his view, opening freshwater trade even once could set a precedent that future governments would struggle to undo. Contracts could outlive political terms. Markets could reshape national priorities. A resource that has always been treated as a public trust could, over time, become something influenced by outside forces. Canada sees protecting water as protecting its future, a mindset that grows even stronger as pressure from the United States continues to build. While Canada was closing every door, pressure inside the United States was moving in the opposite direction. The worsening drought pushed policymakers, analysts, and governors to revisit old ideas that once seemed unrealistic. Think tanks in Washington began circulating studies that explored large-scale pipelines linking Canadian rivers to the American Southwest. Some of these proposals ran hundreds of pages and included cost projections reaching into the tens or even hundreds of billions of dollars. The plans borrowed heavily from the oil and gas industry, imagining water flowing across borders through massive steel corridors just like crude oil does today. Supporters inside the U.S. national security community added a new argument. They warned that freshwater scarcity could undermine economic stability in several states and should be treated as a national security priority. Without long-term access to new supplies, they argued, America's agricultural power, grid reliability, and population growth in the Southwest would all be at risk. To them, a continental pipeline was not a luxury. It was strategic planning. Governors from Arizona, Nevada, and parts of California quietly echoed the same message. With reservoirs dropping and demand rising, they insisted that Canada was the only realistic partner for a stable future water supply. Even if direct talks were not happening, the political momentum inside the United States kept growing. Editorials appeared urging the federal government to think bigger and explore a North American solution. But from Canada's point of view, this movement felt like a shift from cooperation to encroachment. The fear was simple. Once the United States commits billions to pipeline planning, it becomes difficult to walk away. Economic momentum can turn into diplomatic pressure, and diplomatic pressure can evolve into demands. That growing tension is why the story of water is no longer confined to North America. It fits into a much larger global pattern that is now taking shape. What is happening between the United States and Canada is part of a much larger shift taking place around the world. As climate pressure rises and populations grow, water is becoming one of the most sensitive resources on the planet. International organizations and UN analysts have warned for years that freshwater scarcity could become the main trigger of future conflicts, even more destabilizing than oil or gas disputes. Several regions are already showing how serious this risk has become. In Southeast Asia, China controls the upper stretch of the Mekong River, giving Beijing enormous influence over the water supply of countries downstream. In South Asia, India, and Pakistan continue to argue over the Indus River, a lifeline for millions on both sides of the border. In Africa, Ethiopia's massive Nile Dam project has created deep tensions with Egypt and Sudan, raising fears of escalation if negotiations break down. These disputes are early signals of a global shift. As water grows scarce, nations move quickly to protect what they have. Dams, diversions, and river controls turn into strategic leverage, and North America is now following that same trajectory. The US and Canada have joined a growing list of regions where freshwater is becoming a source of competition, not cooperation. This is the context shaping every decision between the two countries. America is running out of options, and Canada is determined to keep full control of the resource that anchors its security. Climate pressure is squeezing both sides, turning routine discussions about rivers or reservoirs into sensitive geopolitical choices. Their next moves will define how the continent adapts to a century where the most important resource is no longer oil, it's water. Which leads to the real question: if America's crisis deepens, will Canada be able to keep refusing? Or will growing pressure reshape the partnership between the two neighbors?